Meredith Chamberlain stood at her kitchen window, watching the scene that had played out every single day for the past 6 months since her husband Eugene's funeral. At exactly 2:30 in the afternoon, Hercules, their massive Chevrolet bull and Eugene's pride and joy, would walk slowly across the pasture to the ancient oak tree where her husband had spent his lunch breaks for 43 years of marriage. The bull would circle the tree once, then settle his 200-pound frame into the exact spot where Eugene used to spread his old army blanket, eat his ham sandwich, and doze in the Kentucky sunshine. Hercules would stay there for exactly 1 hour, as if keeping a sacred appointment that death couldn't cancel. At 67, Meredith had thought she'd seen everything that grief could throw at a person. The empty chair at the breakfast table, the unused work boots by the back door, the silence where Eugene's voice used to fill their farmhouse with stories and laughter. But watching that loyal bull maintain his daily vigil with their deceased owner broke her heart in ways she hadn't known were possible. "Mama, you're torturing yourself standing there every day," said her eldest son Bradley as he entered the kitchen carrying a stack of papers that Meredith had come to dread seeing. At 44, Bradley was a successful real estate attorney in Louisville, but he'd never understood his parents' deep attachment to the family farm that had been in the Chamberlain name since 1897. "I'm not torturing myself. I'm bearing witness." Bearing witness to what? An animal that doesn't understand Daddy's gone? Meredith turned from the window to face her son, seeing Eugene's stubborn jawline, but none of his father's reverence for the land they'd worked together for nearly half a century. "Bradley, that bull understands plenty, more than you give him credit for." "Mama, we need to talk seriously about these offers." Bradley spread the documents across her kitchen table. Contracts from Pinnacle Development Corporation offering $2.3 million for their 200 acres of prime Kentucky farmland. "This is more money than Daddy ever dreamed of. You could buy a nice house in town, be close to medical care and shopping, never worry about money again." Meredith glanced at the contracts, then back out the window where Hercules continued his faithful watch under the oak tree. "And what happens to him?" "The bull? Mama, he's just livestock. We sell him to another farmer or send him to market. You can't base major life decisions on an animal's habits." "Your father would roll over in his grave if he heard you talk about Hercules like that." "Daddy's gone, Mama." And harsh as it sounds, making decisions based on what a dead man might think isn't practical. The words hit Meredith like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they revealed how little her own son understood about the bonds that had held their family together for 4 generations. "Bradley, your father spent every lunch break under that tree for 43 years, rain or shine, winter or summer, said it was the only place on earth where he could think clearly and feel connected to something bigger than himself." "I remember, Mama, but that doesn't change our current situation." "What if it does? What if there's something about that tree, something about Hercules' behavior, that we're not seeing?" Bradley sighed with the patience of an adult humoring an elderly parent's failing grip on reality. "Like what?" Before Meredith could answer, her daughter Carolyn arrived with her own set of concerns. At 41, Carolyn had inherited her father's love for the land, but lived in Cincinnati where she worked as a nurse practitioner. Unlike Bradley, she understood the emotional weight of potentially losing their family heritage. "Mama, I drove past the Hendricks place on the way here," Carolyn said, accepting a cup of coffee and settling at the kitchen table. "Pinnacle's already started clearing trees for their shopping complex. It's heartbreaking to see 150 years of family farming turned into strip malls and chain restaurants." "Which is exactly why we need to sell while we can still get top dollar," Bradley interjected. "Pinnacle's going to develop this entire area whether we cooperate or not. At least this way, Mama gets financial security instead of watching property values collapse when she's surrounded by commercial development." Meredith looked between her 2 children, seeing the same fundamental disagreement that was tearing apart farming families across rural America. Bradley saw land as a financial asset to be optimized. Carolyn saw it as a legacy to be preserved. Neither fully understood what it meant to Eugene, or why Hercules might hold the key to resolving their dilemma. "Children, before we make any decisions, I want to understand something. Your father was a creature of habit, but his daily routine under that tree was more than just habit. He was secretive about it, protective. never wanted to be disturbed during that hour. Maybe he just needed time to think, Carolyn suggested. Or maybe he was hiding something, Bradley said dismissively. Mama, you're looking for mysteries where there aren't any. That evening, as Hercules concluded his daily vigil and slowly returned to the barn, Meredith made a decision that would change everything. She was going to spend tomorrow's lunch hour under that oak tree herself, trying to understand what had drawn her husband there so faithfully and why Hercules continued to honor that sacred time. As she watched the massive bull disappear into the barn, Meredith couldn't shake the feeling that Eugene had left her a message she hadn't learned to read yet, and somehow, Hercules was the key to understanding it. The next morning would begin a journey of discovery that would either save their family farm or finally convince her that letting go was the kindest thing she could do for everyone involved. But first, she had to learn what secrets lay buried under the old oak tree where her husband had spent 15,695 lunch hours over the course of their marriage. Secrets that a loyal bull refused to abandon. The next afternoon at exactly 2:15, Meredith walked across the pasture toward the ancient oak tree, carrying Eugene's old army blanket and the same metal lunch pail he'd used for 4 decades. Her heart pounded with a mixture of grief and anticipation as she approached the spot that had been her husband's private sanctuary. Hercules was already there, standing beside the tree as if expecting her. The massive bull watched her approach with intelligent eyes that seemed to hold approval for her decision to finally join him in this daily ritual. "Hello, old friend," Meredith said softly, spreading Eugene's blanket in the exact spot where she'd watched him sit thousands of times. "Mind if I keep you company today?" Hercules lowered his enormous head and gently touched her shoulder with his muzzle, a gesture of acceptance that brought tears to her eyes. As she settled onto the blanket, the bull positioned himself nearby, maintaining his vigilant watch over the sacred space. For the first time in 6 months, Meredith truly understood the peace Eugene had found here. The view encompassed their entire farm, rolling pastures where 5 generations of Chamberlains had raised cattle, the red barn where Eugene had taught their children to milk cows and mend harnesses, the farmhouse where they'd raised their family and weathered every storm life had thrown at them. But as she sat quietly, absorbing the tranquility that had drawn her husband here daily, something caught her attention. The base of the oak tree showed signs of regular disturbance, not from animals, but from deliberate human activity. The earth around the massive roots had been carefully maintained, almost cultivated, in a way that suggested Eugene had been doing more than just resting here. Curious, Meredith began examining the area more closely. That's when she noticed something that made her breath catch. A small section of ground that had been recently disturbed, with fresh soil that didn't match the compacted earth around it. "Hercules," she whispered, "has someone been digging here?" The bull's reaction was immediate and telling. He moved closer to the disturbed earth and began pawing gently at the fresh soil, as if trying to show her something important. With growing excitement and trepidation, Meredith used her hands to carefully excavate the spot Hercules had indicated. About 18 inches down, her fingers encountered something hard and rectangular, a waterproof container about the size of a shoebox. Inside the container, wrapped in plastic to protect them from moisture, were dozens of documents that made Meredith's hands tremble as she examined them. Legal papers, financial records, and most shocking of all, geological surveys dating back 15 years that identified significant mineral deposits beneath their farm property. The documents revealed that Eugene had been secretly working with geologists and mining consultants to assess the value of coal and natural gas reserves on their land. The surveys indicated potential resources worth over $8 million, far more than Pinnacle Development's $2.3 million offer for the surface rights alone. But the most stunning discovery was a letter Eugene had written to her, dated just 1 week before his fatal heart attack. "My dearest Meredith, if you're reading this, then Hercules has done what I trained him to do. Bring you to this spot when you need answers most. For 15 years, I've been quietly investigating reports that our land sits on valuable mineral deposits. The surveys confirm it's true, but I've kept this secret because I wanted to protect you from the pressure and complications that knowledge would bring. I've been meeting here daily with consultants, lawyers, and geologists, using this tree as my private office to conduct business away from prying eyes. Hercules always accompanied me, and I taught him to guard this spot because I knew someday you might need to find these documents. The mineral rights alone are worth enough to secure our family's future for generations while keeping the farm intact. But more importantly, I discovered that Pinnacle Development knows about these resources. That's the real reason they're so eager to buy our land. They're not planning shopping centers, they're planning strip mining operations that will destroy everything our family has built. Don't let them steal our legacy for a fraction of what it's truly worth. Use these documents to protect our land and our family's future. All my love forever. Eugene P.S. Hercules knows where the rest of the documents are buried. Trust him to show you. Meredith sat in stunned silence, the letter trembling in her hands as the implications sank in. Eugene hadn't just been taking peaceful lunch breaks, he'd been conducting a sophisticated investigation to protect their family from corporate exploitation. Hercules seemed to understand that she'd found what she was looking for. The bull stood up and walked to another spot about 20 feet away, where he began pawing at the ground with the same gentle insistence. Following his lead, Meredith found a second buried container containing contracts with mining companies, correspondence with attorneys, and detailed financial projections showing how mineral extraction could provide sustainable income while preserving the farm's agricultural operations. Eugene had spent years developing a plan that would allow their family to profit from the land's mineral wealth without sacrificing their farming heritage, a plan that Pinnacle Development was trying to circumvent by purchasing the property before the family discovered its true value. As the afternoon sun filtered through the oak tree's branches, Meredith finally understood why Hercules maintained his daily vigil. The loyal bull wasn't just mourning his master, he was guarding a secret that could save everything Eugene had worked to protect. That evening, when Bradley and Carolyn arrived for their planned discussion about the Pinnacle offer, Meredith was waiting for them with Eugene's documents spread across the kitchen table. "Children," she said with a strength in her voice that surprised them all, "we need to have a very different conversation about your father's legacy and our family's future." The look of shock on their faces as they began reading the geological surveys and financial projections told Meredith that everything was about to change. Eugene's secret hadn't died with him. It had been faithfully guarded by a bull who understood that some promises transcend death. Hercules had kept his word, and now it was time for the Chamberlain family to honor Eugene's vision for preserving their heritage while securing their future. The battle to save their farm was just beginning, but for the first time since Eugene's death, Meredith felt like they had the weapons they needed to win. 3 days after discovering Eugene's hidden documents, Meredith's kitchen had been transformed into a war room. Maps, geological surveys, and legal papers covered every surface, while Bradley paced anxiously and Carolyn made phone calls to mining attorneys across Kentucky. "Mama, this changes everything," Bradley said, his real estate attorney instincts now fully engaged. "If Daddy's surveys are accurate, we're sitting on a gold mine, literally. But it also means we're about to face a legal battle that could bankrupt us if we're not careful." Carolyn hung up from her latest call and joined them at the table. "I just spoke with Margaret Thornfield at the Kentucky Mining Rights Law Firm in Lexington. She says Daddy did his homework. These mineral rights contracts are ironclad, and the geological surveys were conducted by the most reputable firm in the state. But here's what worries me," Bradley continued, pointing to correspondence he'd found in Eugene's files. "Look at these letters from Pinnacle's legal team. They knew about the mineral deposits before they ever made us an offer. This whole shopping center development story is a lie." Meredith studied the letters, her anger building as she read Pinnacle's internal communications that Eugene had somehow obtained. The company had planned to purchase the Chamberlain farm and 3 neighboring properties for surface development, then quietly extract millions of dollars worth of coal and natural gas, while the original owners received nothing. "How did your father get access to Pinnacle's private correspondence?" Carolyn asked. According to this note, he had help from someone inside the company, someone who was troubled by their deceptive practices and started feeding him information. Meredith held up a handwritten note signed only with the initials RM. Before they could discuss it further, the phone rang. The caller ID showed Pinnacle Development Corporation. "Mrs. Chamberlain, this is Richard Morrison, Senior Vice President at Pinnacle Development," came a smooth professional voice. "I understand there may have been some delays in finalizing our purchase agreement for your property." Meredith felt her blood pressure spike. This was the man who'd been trying to steal her family's legacy through deception and lies. Mr. Morrison, there won't be any purchase agreement. We've decided to keep the farm in the family. There was a long pause. Mrs. Chamberlain, I hope you're not making this decision based on emotion rather than practical considerations. Our offer represents exceptional value for agricultural property in your area. Your offer represents theft, Mr. Morrison. We know about the mineral deposits. We know about your real development plans, and we know you've been lying to us from the beginning. Another pause, longer this time. Mrs. Chamberlain, I think there may be some misunderstandings that we should discuss in person. Would you be available for a meeting tomorrow afternoon? I'll be available, but I won't be alone. My attorney will be present, along with representatives from the Kentucky Mining Rights Commission. After hanging up, Meredith felt a mixture of satisfaction and apprehension. The real battle was about to begin, but at least now they were fighting with full knowledge of what was at stake. That afternoon, as usual, Hercules made his way to the oak tree for his daily vigil. But this time, Meredith was waiting for him with a specific purpose. According to Eugene's notes, there was one more cache of documents hidden somewhere near the tree, the most important evidence of Pinnacle's illegal activities. Hercules, I need your help one more time, she said softly, as the bull settled beside her on Eugene's old blanket. Show me where Daddy hid the smoking gun. The bull seemed to understand. He stood up and walked to the far side of the tree, where he began digging at a spot that looked completely undisturbed. Following his lead, Meredith found a third container, this one buried deeper and containing documents that made her gasp. Inside were recorded conversations between Pinnacle executives discussing their strategy of deceiving rural property owners about mineral rights, forged geological reports designed to hide resource values, and most damaging of all, evidence of bribes paid to local officials to expedite development permits. Eugene's informant, the mysterious R.M. Walker, was Richard Morrison himself, the same Pinnacle executive who'd just called her. The correspondence revealed that Morrison had grown increasingly uncomfortable with the company's fraudulent practices and had been secretly providing evidence to Eugene while pretending to negotiate for the property. A handwritten note from Morrison explained his motivation. Eugene, I got into development to build communities, not to steal from hard-working families. Pinnacle's practices have become criminal, and I can't be part of it anymore. Use this evidence to protect your family and expose what they're doing to rural America. That evening, Margaret Thornfield drove up from Lexington to review the evidence. As the mining rights attorney examined Eugene's documentation, her expression grew increasingly amazed. Mrs. Chamberlain, your husband assembled one of the most comprehensive cases of corporate fraud I've ever seen. This evidence could bring down Pinnacle's entire Southeast operation and protect dozens of other families from similar exploitation. What do we do now? Now we go on the offensive. Instead of just protecting your property, we expose their criminal enterprise and make sure they pay for what they've done to your family and others. Bradley, who had been skeptical about fighting Pinnacle, was now fully committed to the battle. Mama, Daddy didn't just leave us evidence. He left us a mission. We're not just fighting for our farm anymore. We're fighting for every family that's been targeted by these predators. The next morning, Richard Morrison arrived at the Chamberlain farm not as Pinnacle's negotiator, but as their star witness. The man who had secretly provided Eugene with evidence was ready to testify publicly about the company's illegal activities. Mrs. Chamberlain, Morrison said as they sat under the oak tree where so many secrets had been buried and discovered. Your husband was the most honorable man I ever met. He could have used this evidence just to protect your family, but he insisted on documenting everything so other families would be protected too. Why did you help him? Because what Pinnacle is doing isn't business, it's theft. They're destroying rural communities and stealing generational wealth from families who've worked the same land for over a century. Someone had to stop them. As they planned their legal strategy, Hercules grazed peacefully nearby, still maintaining his daily vigil, but no longer alone in carrying the burden of Eugene's secrets. The loyal bull had fulfilled his promise to his deceased master, and now the battle Eugene had prepared for could finally begin in earnest. But Pinnacle Development had billions of dollars and teams of lawyers at their disposal. The fight to save the Chamberlain legacy and expose corporate fraud would test everything the family had learned about courage, determination, and the power of truth. Eugene's war was about to become their war, with the fate of rural America hanging in the balance.
6 weeks after Richard Morrison's defection to their cause, the Chamberlain farm had become the epicenter of the largest corporate fraud investigation in Kentucky's history. FBI agents had established a temporary field office in Henderson County, while media outlets from across the nation descended on their quiet farming community to cover the story that was being called the Great Rural Land Grab Scandal.
Meredith stood in her pasture watching Hercules maintain his daily vigil under the oak tree, but now the scene looked vastly different. FBI evidence technicians had carefully excavated and documented every hiding spot the bull had revealed, while federal prosecutors used Eugene's meticulously gathered evidence to build a case that would eventually encompass criminal activities in 12 states. "Mama, are you ready for this?" Carolyn asked, approaching from the farmhouse where she'd been helping coordinate media interviews and legal preparation. In 3 hours, Meredith would testify before a federal grand jury about Pinnacle Development's attempted theft of her family's mineral rights. "I think your father prepared me for this moment without my even knowing it," Meredith replied, watching Hercules peacefully graze near the tree that had become a symbol of their fight. "For 43 years, I watched him come out here every day, never understanding he was building a case to protect us all." The scope of Pinnacle's criminal enterprise had proven far more extensive than anyone had imagined. Using Eugene's evidence as a roadmap, federal investigators had uncovered a systematic scheme affecting over 200 rural families across the Southeast. The company had stolen an estimated $400 million in mineral rights through fraudulent contracts, forged geological reports, and bribes to local officials. Bradley, who had transformed from reluctant participant to fierce advocate, joined them in the pasture carrying the morning's newspaper headlines. "Pinnacle CEO arrested, rural families fight back, and bull guard secrets that toppled corporate giant." The Wall Street Journal wants to do a feature story about how Hercules helped expose the fraud, Bradley said, still amazed by the media attention their story was receiving. "They're calling him the most important witness in American agricultural history." Margaret Thornfield arrived from Lexington with updates from the federal courthouse. As the lead attorney representing the affected families, she'd been working 18-hour days to coordinate the massive class action lawsuit against Pinnacle. "Meredith, I have news that would make Eugene proud," she announced. "The Justice Department is offering Pinnacle a plea agreement that includes full restitution to all affected families, plus punitive damages that will fund a new federal program protecting rural mineral rights." "What does that mean for our farm?" "It means you'll receive fair compensation for your mineral rights while maintaining full ownership of your land. More importantly, it means the legal precedent will protect thousands of other farming families from similar exploitation." But perhaps the most meaningful vindication came from Richard Morrison, who had been granted witness protection status after his testimony exposed the full extent of Pinnacle's criminal activities. He visited the farm one last time before relocating to start a new life away from corporate retaliation. "Mrs. Chamberlain, working with your husband these past few years restored my faith in human decency," Morrison said as they sat under the oak tree where so many secrets had been shared. "Eugene never asked for anything except the truth. He could have used our evidence to get rich quick, but instead he insisted on building a case that would protect everyone. What will you do now?" "I'm starting a nonprofit organization to help rural families understand their mineral rights and protect themselves from corporate predators. Going to call it the Eugene Chamberlain Foundation for Agricultural Justice." As Morrison prepared to leave, Hercules approached and gently nuzzled the man who had helped his master protect their family and community. It was a gesture of forgiveness and gratitude that moved everyone to tears. The trial itself lasted 3 months and resulted in convictions for 17 Pinnacle executives, including the CEO, who was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. The company paid $2.3 billion in fines and restitution, while new federal legislation created stronger protections for rural property owners. But for Meredith, the real victory wasn't measured in money or legal precedents. It was measured in the preservation of her family's legacy and the knowledge that Eugene's sacrifice had protected countless other families from similar exploitation. 1 year after discovering the first buried documents, Meredith hosted a celebration on the farm for all the families whose properties had been saved by Eugene's investigation. Over 200 people gathered under the oak tree to honor the man who had died protecting rural America from corporate greed. Dr. Sarah Jenkins from the University of Kentucky's Agricultural Extension Office had studied the case for a research project on rural advocacy. What Eugene Chamberlain accomplished represents one of the most sophisticated grassroots investigations in American history, she told the gathered crowd. He used his daily routine as cover for gathering evidence that exposed a criminal conspiracy affecting thousands of families. As the celebration continued, Hercules maintained his position near the tree, still keeping his daily vigil, but now surrounded by the families whose heritage he had helped preserve. "You know what amazes me most?" Carolyn said to her mother as they watched children play in the same pastures where 5 generations of Chamberlains had grown up. "Daddy never lived to see justice served, but somehow he knew we'd need the strength to finish what he started. He had faith in us," Meredith replied, "and he had faith in Hercules to make sure his message wasn't lost." The massive bull, now something of a celebrity himself, had become a symbol of loyalty and determination that resonated far beyond their Kentucky farm. Visitors came from across the country to see the bull who brought down corporate corruption, and his story had inspired similar investigations in rural communities nationwide. As the sun set over Henderson County, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple, Meredith reflected on how much had changed since that first afternoon when she'd joined Hercules under their sacred tree. Eugene's death had seemed like the end of their family's farming legacy, but it had actually marked the beginning of their most important chapter. The bull still laid down under the tree where his farmer used to rest, but now he was no longer alone in carrying the weight of memory and responsibility. The entire community had joined him in honoring Eugene's legacy while building a future worthy of his sacrifice. Some promises, Meredith had learned, are too important to be broken by death. And sometimes the most powerful testimony comes from those who refuse to abandon their watch, no matter how long the vigil lasts. 5 years after Eugene's death, the Chamberlain farm had become something he never could have imagined, a pilgrimage site for families fighting corporate agricultural fraud across America. What started as one bull's loyalty to his deceased master had evolved into a national movement protecting rural property rights and family farming heritage. Meredith, now 72, stood under the oak tree watching Hercules complete what had become his 1,827th daily vigil since Eugene's passing. The massive bull, though showing his age with graying around his muzzle and a slower gait, still maintained his sacred routine with unwavering dedication. "Mama, the documentary crew from PBS is here," announced Carolyn, who had left her nursing job in Cincinnati to move back home and help manage the farm that now generated sustainable income from carefully managed mineral extraction. They want to film Hercules for their series on American agricultural heroes. The story of the bull who exposed corporate corruption had captured international attention, inspiring similar investigations in Canada, Australia, and the United Kingdom. Hercules had been featured in National Geographic, profiled on 60 Minutes, and even inspired a children's book series about farm animals who protect their families. But for Meredith, the real measure of their success wasn't media attention. It was the dozens of families who visited monthly to thank them for the legal precedent that had saved their own properties from corporate theft. Dr. Margaret Thornfield, now director of the Eugene Chamberlain Foundation for Agricultural Justice, arrived with the quarterly report showing their impact. In 5 years, the foundation had helped 847 rural families protect over $600 million in mineral rights and property values from corporate exploitation. "Meredith, we just received confirmation that the Hendricks family in Tennessee successfully used our legal template to stop a mining company from stealing their generational land," Dr. Thornfield reported. "That makes 93 families this year who've avoided what you almost went through." "Eugene would be proud," Meredith replied, watching Hercules slowly return from his afternoon vigil. "Though I think he'd be amazed that his private investigation became a blueprint for protecting rural America." Bradley, who had left his Louisville law practice to establish a rural property rights legal clinic on the farm, joined them with news that demonstrated the lasting impact of their father's work. "The Kentucky legislature just passed the Eugene Chamberlain Rural Protection Act," he announced. "It requires all mineral rights contracts to include independent geological surveys and mandatory waiting periods before final signing. No more families will be cheated the way Pinnacle tried to cheat us." The farmhouse itself had been transformed into a resource center where families could access legal help, geological consulting, and advocacy support. Eugene's old office, where he'd once secretly planned his investigation, now served as a library containing every document, legal precedent, and resource guide needed to fight corporate agricultural fraud. Most remarkably, Richard Morrison had returned to Kentucky after completing his witness protection program, establishing his own consulting firm that helped rural families understand the true value of their properties before making any development decisions. "Mrs. Chamberlain, your husband saved my soul," Morrison told her during his monthly visit to the farm. "Working with him taught me that business should serve families and communities, not destroy them for profit." But perhaps the most meaningful transformation was in the local community itself. Henderson County had become a model for rural economic development that preserved agricultural heritage while providing modern opportunities. Young people who had once fled to cities were now returning to start businesses, raise families, and continue farming traditions they'd once thought were obsolete. Tommy Watkins, a 28-year-old who'd grown up on a neighboring farm, had established a sustainable agriculture consulting business inspired by the Chamberlain story. "Mr. Eugene showed us that we don't have to choose between tradition and prosperity," Tommy explained to visitors. "We can honor our heritage while building sustainable futures for our children." The oak tree itself had been designated as a Kentucky historical landmark, with a bronze plaque reading, "Under this tree, Eugene Chamberlain planned the investigation that exposed the great rural land grab scandal and protected family farming heritage across America. His loyal bull, Hercules, faithfully guards this sacred spot in eternal tribute to a man who chose truth over comfort." On the 5th anniversary of Eugene's death, hundreds of people gathered for the annual Memorial Day celebration that had become a tradition throughout rural Kentucky. Families who'd been saved by Eugene's investigation brought their children to meet Hercules and hear the story of how one farmer's courage had changed everything. As the evening wound down and visitors began departing, Meredith found herself alone with Hercules under the oak tree where their journey had begun. The bull, though clearly aging, still possessed the intelligent eyes and gentle demeanor that had first shown her where to find Eugene's buried secrets. "Old friend, you've kept your promise longer than anyone could have asked," she said softly, stroking his graying neck. "Daddy's message has been delivered. His work is complete." Hercules seemed to understand. For the first time in 5 years, he didn't settle into his usual spot for the evening vigil. Instead, he walked slowly toward the barn, pausing once to look back at the tree before continuing home. 3 weeks later, Hercules peacefully passed away in his sleep, surrounded by the family he'd protected and the legacy he'd helped preserve. Veterinarians said he'd lived longer than any bull in Kentucky records, sustained by purpose and love that transcended normal animal lifespans. The funeral drew thousands of visitors from across America. Hercules was buried beneath the oak tree where he'd maintained his faithful watch, his grave marked with a simple stone reading, "Hercules, loyal guardian of sacred promises." At the dedication ceremony, Carolyn read from a letter Eugene had written but never sent, found among his personal papers after Hercules' death. "My dearest Meredith, if you're reading this, then both Hercules and I have completed our earthly missions. I trained that bull to guard more than secrets. I trained him to guard hope. Hope that truth could defeat lies, that families could defeat corporations, and that love could defeat greed. As long as people remember our story, that hope will never die." Today, visitors still come to sit under the oak tree where Eugene once planned his investigation, and Hercules maintained his vigil. Children learn about the farmer who chose courage over convenience and the bull who refused to abandon his post until justice was served. The Chamberlain farm continues operating as both working agricultural land and educational center, proving that rural heritage and modern prosperity can coexist when communities have the courage to fight for their values. And sometimes, late in the afternoon when the Kentucky sun filters through the oak tree's branches, visitors swear they can still see the shadow of a loyal bull maintaining his eternal watch over the place where one man's determination changed the course of American agriculture forever. Some bonds, the locals will tell you, are too strong to be broken by death. Some promises are too sacred to be abandoned by time. And some stories are too important to be forgotten by history. Eugene Chamberlain and Hercules had proven all three truths. leaving behind a legacy that would protect rural families for generations to come. This bull still lays down under the tree where his farmer used to rest.